In the dense, sweltering atmosphere of a packed New York City bus, Jamal stood, gripping a metal bar above his head to steady himself against the vehicle's frequent jolts and stops. The air was thick with a mingling sense of the city, sweat, fast food, and a hint of exhaust fumes seeping in through the open windows. Jamal, an ex-military man, radiated a calm, composed demeanor, his eyes scanning the crowded interior with practiced vigilance. His dark skin, chiseled features, and the slight but telling slouch of his broad shoulders hinted at the weight of past burdens and current struggles. The bus was a cacophony of chatter, the hum of conversations blending into a background noise that almost masked the mutterings of an elderly woman seated nearby. Margaret, a frail figure with a face etched with lines of bitterness and regret, sat clutching her worn handbag. Her white hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her faded floral dress spoke of better days long past. She eyed Jamal with a mixture of disdain and suspicion, her lips moving almost imperceptibly as she voiced her thoughts aloud. "These people always causing trouble," she whispered, her voice just loud enough to be heard by those immediately around her. "Why can't they just stay out of sight?" Jamal, who had learned to recognize and often ignore such prejudiced remarks, tightened his grip on the bar but kept his eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the venomous words. The other passengers, sensing the tension, shifted uncomfortably, some casting sympathetic glances towards Jamal, while others pretended not to hear. Margaret continued, seemingly emboldened by Jamal's silence. "They think they own this city now, pushing decent folks like us aside." A young woman sitting across from Margaret finally spoke up, her voice tinged with irritation. "Ma'am, maybe you should keep your opinions to yourself." Margaret scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "You don't know what it's like. I've seen this city change, and not for the better." Before the confrontation could escalate, a sudden gasp escaped Margaret's lips. Her hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide with panic. She swayed, then collapsed into the aisle, her body convulsing as the bus lurched to a halt. The passengers recoiled, a collective gasp filling the air, but it was Jamal who sprang into action. "Someone call 911, he shouted, his voice commanding and urgent. He dropped to his knees beside Margaret, his military training kicking in as he assessed her condition. Her breathing was erratic, and her pulse weak. Jamal tilted her head back, ensuring her airway was clear, and began administering chest compressions. "Stay with me, ma'am," he urged, his hands moving rhythmically, his focus unbroken. "You're going to be okay." The bus driver had already radioed for help, and the passengers watched in stunned silence, their earlier discomfort forgotten in the face of the emergency. Minutes felt like hours as Jamal worked, sweat beading on his forehead. Finally, the distant wail of sirens signaled the arrival of paramedics. They rushed aboard, quickly taking over from Jamal. One of the paramedics, a young woman with a calm demeanor, looked at Jamal with respect. "You did good," she said. "She's got a fighting chance because of you." Jamal nodded, stepping back to let them work. He watched as they loaded Margaret onto a stretcher, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The bus driver announced that they would have to wait for a replacement vehicle, and the passengers began to disembark, murmuring in hushed tones about the dramatic turn of events. As Jamal stepped off the bus, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he saw the young woman who had earlier defended him. "Thank you for what you did," she said, her eyes earnest. "That was incredible." Jamal offered a modest smile. "Just did what needed to be done." The crowd dispersed, and Jamal found himself walking the familiar streets of the city, his thoughts drifting to his son, Malik. The teenager had been distant lately, struggling with his own battles at school and at home. Jamal hoped that one day, Malik would understand the importance of compassion and doing the right thing, no matter the circumstances. As he walked, Jamal couldn't help but think about Margaret. Prejudice had nearly cost her her life today, yet it was someone she despised who had come to her rescue. Life had a strange way of turning the tables, forcing people to confront their own biases and misconceptions. Later that evening, Jamal sat in his small apartment, the sounds of the city filtering through the thin walls. Malik was in his room, the door closed as usual. Jamal sighed, knowing that reconnecting with his son would be a slow and challenging process. But today's events had given him a renewed sense of purpose and a glimmer of hope. If he could reach out to a bitter old woman and save her life, perhaps he could also find a way to bridge the gap between himself and Malik. The phone rang, and Jamal answered, his voice weary but calm. It was the hospital, informing him that Margaret was stable and wanted to see him, to thank him personally. Jamal agreed, knowing that this was just the beginning of a journey toward understanding and healing, for Margaret, for himself, and for Malik. At the hospital, Margaret slowly opened her eyes, her vision still blurry from the medication. As the room came into focus, she noticed a figure standing by the door. It was Jamal, the man who had saved her life on the bus. Her initial confusion soon gave way to a wave of embarrassment. How could she face the person whom she had treated so poorly, yet who had shown her nothing but kindness in return? Margaret's mind raced back to the bus incident. She had been so quick to judge, so eager to let her prejudices dictate her actions. Now, lying in a hospital bed, she felt a deep sense of shame. She watched as Jamal spoke with a doctor outside her room. The doctor was praising him, clearly impressed by his quick thinking and medical skills. Jamal, however, seemed uncomfortable with the attention, his humble demeanor evident even from a distance. "You're a hero," the doctor said, patting Jamal on the back. "I just did what anyone else would do," Jamal replied modestly. Margaret's heart ached with guilt. She had been so wrong about him, so blinded by her own bitterness. She needed to make amends, but the words felt heavy on her tongue. As Jamal turned to leave, their eyes met for a brief moment. Margaret wanted to call out to him, to thank him, but her voice faltered. She watched him walk away, feeling a mix of gratitude and regret. As the days passed, Margaret found herself reflecting deeply on her actions. The hospital room became a place of introspection. She replayed the events over and over in her mind, each time feeling the sting of her own harsh words. She realized how unfairly she had judged Jamal, not knowing anything about his life or his struggles. One afternoon, a nurse entered Margaret's room with a kind smile. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Walker?" "Better, thank you," Margaret replied. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," the nurse responded, pulling up a chair. "Do you know anything about the man who saved me?" Margaret's voice was hesitant. "Jamal." The nurse's eyes lit up. "He's quite the hero around here. He used to be in the military, you know, a real lifesaver in more ways than one." Margaret nodded, taking in the information. She had been so quick to judge him based on his appearance, without knowing the person behind the uniform. It was a sobering realization. Deciding that she needed to see Jamal again, Margaret asked the nurse if she could get in touch with him. The nurse agreed, promising to relay the message. Margaret spent the next few days rehearsing what she would say, hoping to find the right words to express her gratitude and remorse. When the day finally came, Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness in her chest. She had never been good at admitting her faults, but this time was different. She owed it to Jamal to make things right. As she waited in her hospital room, she heard a knock on the door. "Come in," she called, her voice trembling slightly. Jamal stepped into the room, his expression calm and composed. "Mrs. Walker, you wanted to see me?" Margaret took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "Yes, please, have a seat." Jamal sat down, his eyes meeting hers. The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence for a moment before Margaret finally found the courage to speak. "I owe you an apology," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so wrong about you. I treated you terribly on that bus, and yet you saved my life. I can't even begin to express how sorry I am." Jamal listened intently, his face softening. "Mrs. Walker, everyone makes mistakes. What's important is that you're willing to acknowledge them and make amends." Margaret felt a surge of relief at his words. "Thank you, Jamal. I want to do better. I want to be better." Jamal nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "It's never too late to change, Mrs. Walker. We all have our own battles to fight." As Jamal stood to leave, Margaret felt a newfound sense of hope. She watched him walk out of the room, feeling a glimmer of redemption. She knew she had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to take the first step. Margaret's time in the hospital became a period of transformation. She began to see the world through a different lens, one that was no longer clouded by prejudice and bitterness. She knew that her journey towards redemption would not be easy, but she was determined to make a change. In the days that followed, Margaret made a conscious effort to educate herself, to understand the experiences of those she had once judged so harshly. She read books, watched documentaries, and engaged in conversations that challenged her perspective. Each day was a step towards breaking down the walls she had built around herself. One evening, as Margaret was preparing to leave the hospital, she saw Jamal again. He was talking to a nurse, his warm smile lighting up the room. Margaret felt a swell of gratitude as she approached him. "Jamal," she called softly. He turned, his eyes meeting hers with a look of surprise. "Mrs. Walker, how are you feeling?" "Better, thanks to you," she replied sincerely. "I wanted to ask you something. Would it be all right if I joined you at the community center sometime? I want to give back, and I think it's a good place to start." Jamal's smile widened. "Of course, Mrs. Walker. You're always welcome." Margaret felt a sense of purpose as she left the hospital that day. She knew that her journey was just beginning, but she was ready to face it head-on. With Jamal's example of kindness and humility guiding her, she felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. Returning home after the dramatic events of the day, Jamal felt the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. The small apartment he shared with his son, Malik, was modest but filled with mementos of a past life he often found himself reminiscing about. Pictures of Jamal in his military uniform, smiling proudly, adorned the walls alongside school photos of Malik, whose expression had grown more sullen over the years. Pushing open the door to Malik's room, Jamal found his son hunched over his desk, earphones on, lost in his own world. The room was a chaotic mix of scattered textbooks, video game consoles, and posters of athletes and musicians, icons of a world Malik seemed to prefer over the one he shared with Jamal. "Hey, Malik," Jamal said softly, hoping not to startle him. "Can we talk for a minute?" Malik glanced up, pulling one earphone out. "What is it, Dad?" he replied, his tone indifferent, almost resigned. Jamal took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I know things have been tough between us lately. I want to understand what's going on with you." Malik shrugged, his eyes drifting back to his computer screen. "Ain fine. Just school and stuff, you know." "School and stuff." "Malik, you're slipping in your grades, and you barely talk to me anymore. This isn't just stuff." Malik sighed, clearly frustrated. "You wouldn't get it, Dad. Everything's different now. You don't know what it's like." Jamal felt a pang of guilt. He knew his deployment had taken a toll on their relationship. "Maybe I don't know exactly what you're going through, but I want to. I want to help. Help. Like you helped that lady on the bus today." Malik's words were laced with sarcasm, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Yes, like I helped her," Jamal said, seizing the moment. "Helping people isn't just about saving lives. It's about being there for them, understanding them. I want to be there for you, Malik." Malik's expression softened slightly, but the walls he'd built around himself remained. It's hard, Dad. School is hard. Everything feels different since you came back." Before Jamal could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and saw it was the hospital. "Hold on, Malik. I need to take this." "Mr. Jamal?" The voice on the other end was professional but warm. "This is Nurse Thompson from the hospital. Mrs. Margaret has requested to see you. She wants to thank you personally for what you did today." Jamal was taken aback. The last thing he expected was for the woman who had hurled such hurtful words at him to want to see him again. Sure. I can come by tomorrow," he replied, still processing the request. As he hung up, he turned back to Malik. "That was the hospital. The lady I helped wants to see me." Malik's eyes widened slightly. "Why would she want to see you after everything she said?" "People can change, Malik. Sometimes it takes a moment like today to make them see things differently." Malik nodded, but the skepticism in his eyes remained. "Maybe." The next day, Jamal found himself standing outside Margaret's hospital room, feeling a mix of emotions. He knocked gently and heard her faint voice invite him in. "Come in, Mr. Jamal," Margaret said, her voice softer than he remembered. She was sitting up in bed, looking frail but alert. Jamal stepped inside, unsure of what to expect. "Mrs. Margaret, you wanted to see me?" "Yes, please sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair beside her bed. "I owe you an apology. And a thank you. You saved my life yesterday, and I was so wrong about you." Jamal took a seat, nodding slowly. "You were scared." People say things they don't mean when they're scared. Margaret shook her head. No, it wasn't just fear. It was ignorance, prejudice. I've been carrying this bitterness for so long, and you showed me kindness when I showed you nothing but hatred. Jamal looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. We all have our burdens, Mrs. Margaret. I'm just glad I could help. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. You've given me a chance to change, Mr. Jamal, and I intend to take it. I want to make amends, to understand people better, to be better. Jamal felt a sense of relief wash over him. It's never too late to change, and you don't have to do it alone. As he left the hospital, Jamal couldn't help but think about his son. He hoped that his actions might serve as an example for Malik, showing him that redemption and understanding were always possible, no matter how far apart people might seem. Returning home, Jamal found Malik waiting for him in the living room. How did it go with the lady from the bus? Malik asked, his curiosity piqued. It went well, Jamal replied, sitting down beside his son. She's going to try to change. She's going to try to be better. Malik looked at his father, a hint of hope in his eyes. Do you think people can really change, Dad? Jamal smiled, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. Ido, Malik. I really do. Jamal stood at the entrance of Margaret's hospital room, feeling a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. The room was bathed in a sterile white light, and the steady beep of the heart monitor provided a rhythmic reassurance of life. Margaret lay in the bed, propped up by pillows, her frail figure seeming even smaller against the expanse of the white sheets. She turned her head slowly as he entered, her eyes meeting his with a complex mixture of emotions. Jamal, she began, her voice shaky but determined, I know I owe you more than just a thank you. Jamal nodded, stepping closer but still maintaining a respectful distance. You don't owe me anything, ma'am. I just did what anyone would do. Margaret shook her head, her eyes welling up with tears. No, not anyone. Especially not after the way I treated you. There was a moment of silence, heavy and loaded with unspoken words. Jamal shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to navigate this unexpected territory. Look, ma'am, people say things they don't mean, especially when they're hurting. Margaret sighed deeply, pressing her hands together as if in prayer. It's not just about what I said on that bus. It's about a lifetime of saying things like that, of thinking like that. I've been so angry for so long, and it's poisoned me. Jamal tilted his head slightly, his curiosity piqued. Anger at what, if you don't mind me asking? Margaret looked out the window, her gaze distant. My husband died in the war, you know.
Vietnam.
He was a good man, but he came back different. And then he left me, left us. I guess I blamed everyone I could, except the right people. And you reminded me of him, somehow. Tall, strong, military. It wasn't fair to you. Jamal felt a pang of empathy. I understand. War changes people. It changed me too, in ways I'm still figuring out. Margaret turned back to him, her eyes earnest. I want to change, Jamal. I need to, and I want to start by doing something good. I heard you're involved with a community organization. Jamal was taken aback by her sudden shift in focus. Yeah, I volunteer at the community center. We do a lot of outreach, especially for kids and veterans. Margaret nodded, determination hardening her features. I want to help. I don't know how much I can do, but I need to try. Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into her new mission with a fervor that surprised even herself. She attended meetings at the community center, initially standing on the periphery, observing. Jamal was there, always a steady presence, offering support when needed but never pushing her. He had his own struggles at home with Malik, whose teenage rebellion was growing more pronounced by the day. One evening, as Margaret was preparing for a community event, she stood in front of her mirror, facing her own reflection. Her eyes were stern, as if challenging herself to face her past. She had spent years hiding behind walls of bitterness and prejudice, and now she was dismantling those walls brick by brick. The process was painful but necessary. At the same time, Jamal was at home, attempting once again to bridge the widening gap between him and Malik. Son, I know things have been tough since I got back, but I'm trying. We can get through this together. Malik, slouched on the couch with his headphones on, barely glanced at him. "You don't get it, Dad. You don't know what it's like to be me." Jamal sighed, frustration and helplessness mingling in his chest. "Maybe I don't, but I want to understand. We're family, Malik. We can't give up on each other." The day of the community event arrived, and the center was buzzing with activity. Margaret, wearing a volunteer badge, moved through the crowd with a purpose. She greeted people, helped set up booths, and even managed a few smiles. Jamal watched her from a distance, impressed by her transformation. He was busy coordinating activities, but he always made sure to keep an eye on Malik, who was reluctantly tagging along. As the event progressed, Margaret found herself drawn into a conversation with a young woman who was sharing her struggles with addiction. Margaret listened intently, offering words of comfort and understanding. It was in that moment she realized how much she had changed. She was no longer the bitter, angry woman on the bus. She was someone who could offer hope and kindness. Jamal approached her later, a look of approval in his eyes. "You're doing great, Margaret. People appreciate what you're doing here." Margaret smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Jamal. I wouldn't have gotten this far without your support." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an elderly man, his face lined with years of experience and sorrow. He walked straight to Margaret, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Margaret?" he asked, his voice trembling. Margaret looked at him, confusion and recognition battling for dominance in her mind. "Yes, do I know you?" The man took a deep breath. "It's me, Robert. Your husband." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Margaret's knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Jamal hadn't caught her. The crowd around them fell silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. Margaret stared at Robert, her mind racing. "But you died. They told me you died." Robert shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "No, Margaret. I survived, but I was a broken man. I couldn't come back to you like that. I'm so sorry." Jamal, holding Margaret steady, felt a surge of emotion. He looked at Malik, who was standing nearby, wide-eyed and silent. This moment of revelation was not just for Margaret, but for all of them. It was a moment of truth, of confronting the past and understanding the depth of their connections. Margaret, tears flowing freely now, reached out and touched Robert's face. "All these years, I thought you were dead. How could you leave us like that?" Robert clasped her hand, his voice choked with emotion. "I was lost, Margaret. But seeing you here, doing good, it gives me hope. Can you ever forgive me?" The room was enveloped in a profound silence as everyone awaited Margaret's response. She looked at Jamal, then at Malik, and back at Robert. "I don't know if I can forgive you right away, but I want to try. For all of us." Jamal felt a deep sense of relief and hope. This moment of reconciliation was a testament to the power of empathy and understanding. As Margaret and Robert embraced, he looked at Malik, who gave him a small, tentative smile. It was a beginning, a fragile but promising start to healing and connection. Margaret lay in her hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptics filling her nostrils, contrasting sharply with the turmoil in her mind. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the occasional murmur of nurses outside. She stared at the ceiling, replaying the events on the bus over and over. The image of Jamal, the man she had wronged with her harsh words, saving her life without hesitation, haunted her. How could she have been so blind, so cruel? She was lost in thought when the door creaked open. Jamal stepped in, his tall frame filling the doorway. His expression was neutral, perhaps a bit wary. Margaret felt a pang of guilt and shame wash over her. She had asked to see him, but now that he was here, she wasn't sure how to begin. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson," Jamal greeted her, his voice steady but cautious. "Hello, Jamal," Margaret replied, her voice trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. I wanted to thank you for what you did on the bus." Jamal nodded, stepping closer to the bed. "I'm glad you're okay," he said simply. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Margaret struggled to find the right words. How could she ever make up for the things she had said? The prejudices she had held onto for so long? "I owe you an apology," she finally said, her eyes filling with tears. "I've been so wrong about so many things. I've been carrying around so much anger and bitterness. But you showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it." Jamal's expression softened slightly. He pulled a chair over and sat down beside her bed. "We all have our battles, Mrs. Thompson. Sometimes, we just need someone to show us a different way." Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes. "I've been thinking a lot since the incident. I need to change. I want to make amends, to do something good with the time I have left." Jamal's eyes met hers, and she saw a glimmer of hope there. "It's never too late to change," he said gently. Margaret felt a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose. "There's an organization you volunteer with, isn't there? I'd like to help." Jamal's eyebrows raised in surprise. "The community center? You want to volunteer there?" "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "I want to contribute, to give back. Maybe I can start to make up for my past mistakes." Jamal smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "We'd be happy to have you, Mrs. Thompson." Over the next few weeks, Margaret threw herself into her new role at the community center. At first, she was nervous, unsure of how she would be received. But Jamal was there, guiding her, introducing her to the other volunteers, and helping her find her footing. Slowly, she began to feel a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as Margaret was sorting donations, she overheard a conversation between Jamal and another volunteer. They were discussing an upcoming event to raise funds for the center. Margaret felt a pang of anxiety. She had been avoiding large gatherings, afraid of facing judgment and her own insecurities. But she knew she needed to face her fears. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of dread. She sat down at her small desk and began to write in her journal, something she hadn't done in years. As the words flowed, she confronted the demons that had haunted her for so long: the loss of her husband, the estrangement from her children, and the bitterness that had consumed her. The next day, Margaret arrived at the community center early. She found Jamal in the main hall, setting up for the event. "Jamal," she called softly. He turned, a look of surprise on his face. "Mrs. Thompson, you're here early." "I wanted to talk to you," she said, her voice steady. "I've been facing some of my past, and I want you to know how much your support means to me." Jamal nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We're all here to support each other. That's what community is about." As the event began, Margaret felt a sense of nervous anticipation. She mingled with the guests, offering smiles and kind words. It was a far cry from the woman she had been just weeks ago. She felt a sense of pride and purpose. Midway through the event, the atmosphere was filled with warmth and camaraderie. Margaret was talking to a young woman about the center's programs when she noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Her heart skipped a beat. It was someone she hadn't seen in years, her estranged daughter, Emily. "Mom." Emily's voice was filled with shock and confusion. "Emily." Margaret's voice trembled. "What are you doing here?" "I volunteer here," Emily said, her eyes wide with surprise. "But what are you doing here?" Margaret felt a rush of emotions. "I'm trying to make amends, Emily. I've made so many mistakes, but I'm trying to change." Emily's eyes softened. "I've missed you, Mom." Margaret felt tears well up in her eyes. "I've missed you too, honey." Jamal approached, sensing the emotional moment. "Everything okay here?" Margaret turned to him, her face glowing with gratitude. "Jamal, this is my daughter, Emily." Jamal extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Emily." Emily shook his hand, a smile forming on her lips. "Nice to meet you too, Jamal." As the event continued, Margaret felt a renewed sense of hope. She had faced her past, confronted her demons, and taken steps toward a better future. And with Jamal and Emily by her side, she knew she wasn't alone on this journey. The evening ended with a sense of accomplishment and unity. Margaret, Jamal, and Emily stood together, looking out at the bustling community center. It was a new beginning, a chance for redemption and connection. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt truly at peace. Margaret sat in her small hospital room, the sterile white walls closing in on her. She couldn't shake the image of Jamal, the man who had saved her life on the crowded bus. The memory of her own harsh words echoed in her mind, filling her with a deep sense of shame. As she stared at the door, a knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The door creaked open and Jamal stepped in, his tall, imposing figure almost filling the room. Despite his size, there was a gentleness in his eyes that Margaret had failed to see before. "Hello, Miss Margaret," Jamal greeted her softly, his voice a calming presence in the tense atmosphere. "Jamal," Margaret began, her voice wavering, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life and I was so awful to you." Jamal smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "You don't have to thank me, ma'am. I just did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," Margaret insisted, her voice gaining strength. "Not after the way I treated you. I need to make this right." The conversation was awkward, filled with pauses and hesitations, but beneath it lay a genuine desire for understanding and forgiveness. Jamal told her about his life, his time in the military, and his struggles to reconnect with his son, Malik. Margaret listened intently, her heart aching with each new revelation. After their conversation, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do more. She decided to volunteer at a community organization that Jamal frequented, hoping to atone for her past behavior. The decision wasn't easy. It forced her to confront her own prejudices and the bitterness that had taken root in her heart. On the day of her first volunteer event, Margaret stood in front of her mirror, taking a deep breath. The woman staring back at her looked different, softer, more vulnerable. She was ready to face her demons and make amends. Meanwhile, Jamal was dealing with his own struggles. Malik had been distant, his grades slipping, and his attitude growing more defiant by the day. Jamal knew that his son was hurting, but he didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. One evening, Jamal sat down with Malik, determined to break through the wall that had grown between them. "Malik," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "I know things have been tough lately, and I want to understand what's going on with you." Malik looked away, his jaw clenched. "You wouldn't get it, Dad. You were never around." The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I know I wasn't there as much as I should have been, and I'm sorry for that. But I'm here now, and I want to be here for you." Malik's eyes softened, but he remained silent. Jamal knew it would take time, but he was determined to keep trying. A few days later, Margaret and Jamal found themselves at a community event, working side by side. The atmosphere was lively, filled with laughter and the sound of children playing. Margaret marveled at the sense of unity and purpose that filled the air. As they were setting up tables, a woman approached them, her face lighting up with recognition when she saw Margaret. "Margaret?" the woman asked, her voice filled with a mix of surprise and emotion. Margaret turned, her eyes widening in shock. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes flicking to Jamal and then back to Margaret. "I think we need to talk. There's something you need to know." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as Eleanor led her and Jamal to a quieter corner. Eleanor's words came out in a rush, revealing a secret that had been buried for decades. Margaret's late husband had served alongside Jamal's father in the military. They had been close friends, almost like brothers. When Margaret's husband had passed away, Jamal's father had promised to look out for her, but they had lost touch over the years. The revelation hit Margaret like a tidal wave. She felt a mix of emotions, shock, grief, and an overwhelming sense of connection. Jamal, too, was visibly moved, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I had no idea," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "All this time, I thought I was alone, but we were connected all along." Jamal nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "It seems our lives were intertwined before we even met." The weight of the revelation brought them both to tears, but it also forged a new bond between them. They talked for hours, sharing memories and stories, finding solace in their shared history. As the event drew to a close, Malik arrived, having decided to join his father. He watched from a distance as Margaret and Jamal laughed and cried together, their connection palpable. Margaret turned to see Malik standing there, and her heart swelled with a mix of hope and regret. She approached him slowly, her eyes filled with sincerity. "Malik," she began, her voice trembling, "I owe you an apology too. I've been so blinded by my own pain that I couldn't see the wonderful person you are. I hope you can forgive me." Malik looked at his father, then back at Margaret. Slowly, he nodded, a tentative smile forming on his lips. "It's okay. We all have stuff to work through." In that moment, the three of them, Margaret, Jamal, and Malik, stood together, united by a newfound understanding and empathy. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it together, stepping into a new era of connection and redemption. Margaret lay in the hospital bed, her eyes fluttering open to the dim light filtering through the blinds. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room was sharp in her nostrils, and the steady beeping of the heart monitor was a constant reminder of her fragility. As her vision cleared, she noticed a figure standing by the door. It was Jamal, the ex-military man who had saved her life on the bus. He stood there, a quiet strength radiating from him, his eyes filled with concern. "You're awake," he said softly, stepping closer to her bed. Margaret's initial reaction was confusion, followed by a wave of shame. She remembered the cruel words she had spat at him just before her collapse. Here was the man she had berated, the man whose skin color she had judged so harshly, and he had been the one to save her life. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice weak, "for what I said on the bus." Jamal nodded, accepting her apology with a grace that surprised her. "It's okay, ma'am. What's important is that you're okay now." The days that followed were a period of deep reflection for Margaret. As she lay in her hospital bed, she replayed the events of that fateful bus ride over and over in her mind. She had been so quick to judge, so ready to lash out with her bitterness and prejudice. And yet, when her life had hung in the balance, it was Jamal who had come to her aid without a second thought. Margaret's thoughts were interrupted by a nurse entering the room with a bouquet of flowers. "These are from Mr. Jamal," the nurse said, placing the flowers on the bedside table. Margaret's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and guilt. She knew she had to do more than just apologize. She had to make amends. She had to change. After being discharged from the hospital, Margaret decided to volunteer at a community organization that Jamal was involved with. It was a small step, but it was a step towards redemption. She hoped that by helping others, she could begin to atone for her past behavior. On her first day at the community center, Margaret felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She was out of her comfort zone, surrounded by people she had once dismissed or looked down upon. But she was determined to push through her discomfort. Jamal was there, organizing supplies and directing volunteers. When he saw Margaret, he gave her a nod of acknowledgement. "Glad you could make it," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Margaret nodded back, grateful for the opportunity. "I want to help," she said simply. As the days went by, Margaret found herself growing more comfortable in her new role. She began to see the people around her not as stereotypes or strangers, but as individuals with their own stories and struggles. She also saw a different side of Jamal, not just the hero who had saved her life, but a dedicated and compassionate man who was deeply committed to his community. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at the center, Margaret and Jamal sat down for a cup of coffee. The conversation started off light, but soon turned to deeper topics. "Why do you do this?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. "Why spend so much of your time helping others?" Jamal took a sip of his coffee, contemplating his answer. "I guess it's my way of making a difference," he said finally. "After serving in the military, I realized that there are battles to be fought here at home too. Battles against poverty, against prejudice, against hopelessness. This is my way of continuing to serve." Margaret nodded, feeling a sense of admiration for the man sitting across from her. "I wish I had realized that sooner," she said quietly. "I've wasted so much time being bitter and angry." Jamal reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. "It's never too late to change," he said gently. "What's important is that you're here now, making a difference." As Margaret continued her work at the community center, she also began to face her own inner demons. She confronted the painful memories and experiences that had shaped her bitterness and slowly began to let them go. She found solace in the friendships she was forming and in the knowledge that she was contributing to something greater than herself. Meanwhile, Jamal was dealing with his own struggles at home. His son, Malik, was still distant and rebellious, and Jamal was finding it increasingly difficult to connect with him. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Jamal found himself confiding in Margaret. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice filled with frustration. Malik just won't open up to me. Margaret listened, her heart aching for Jamal. She knew how important it was for him to rebuild his relationship with his son. Maybe he just needs time, she suggested. And maybe he needs to see that you're not just his father, but a person with your own struggles and fears. Jamal nodded, considering her words. I hope you're right, he said quietly. The turning point came during a community event that Margaret and Jamal had organized together. It was a celebration of the progress they had made, and a chance for the community to come together and support one another. The atmosphere was filled with laughter and music, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a sense of true belonging. As the evening drew to a close, a woman approached Margaret, her face pale with shock. Margaret, she said, her voice trembling, I need to talk to you. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. What's wrong? She asked, her heart pounding. The woman took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. There's something you need to know, she said. Something about your past. And Jamal's. Margaret's mind raced, trying to make sense of the woman's words. What are you talking about? She demanded. The woman hesitated, then began to speak. Years ago, when you were still a young woman, you had a child. A child you thought you had lost. But that child didn't die. He was taken away, adopted by another family. And that child is Jamal. Margaret felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. She stared at the woman, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had just heard. Jamal was her son. The son she had thought she had lost forever. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she turned to look at Jamal, who was standing a few feet away, talking to Malik. She felt a wave of emotions: shock, disbelief, joy, and an overwhelming sense of love. Jamal, she called out, her voice breaking. Jamal turned, his eyes widening as he saw the expression on her face. What's wrong? He asked, stepping closer. Margaret took a deep breath, her hands trembling. You're my son, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. You're the child I thought I had lost. Jamal stared at her, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman stepped forward, explaining the details of the adoption and the circumstances that had led to their separation. As the truth sank in, Jamal felt a surge of emotions: anger, confusion, and finally, a deep sense of connection. Margaret reached out, her hand trembling as she touched Jamal's cheek. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice filled with sorrow. I never meant to lose you. Jamal felt tears welling up in his eyes as he looked at the woman who had given him life. I don't know what to say, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Malik, who had been watching the scene unfold, stepped forward, his eyes wide with shock. Dad, he said, his voice trembling. What's going on? Jamal turned to his son, pulling him into a tight embrace. It's a long story, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of pain and hope. But it looks like we have a lot to talk about. As the three of them stood there, holding on to each other, Margaret felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had found her son, and in doing so, she had found a chance at redemption. Through their shared journey of reflection, empathy, and forgiveness, they had discovered a deeper connection than any of them had ever imagined. And in that moment, they knew they were no longer alone. They were a family. Margaret had been attending the community center regularly, dedicated to making amends for her past prejudices and seeking a sense of purpose. Jamal, who had been helping Malik with his school troubles, found solace in seeing Margaret's transformation. It was during one of these bustling community events that an unexpected visitor arrived, turning their worlds upside down. As the event unfolded, filled with laughter, conversations, and the occasional clinking of cups, Margaret spotted an elderly man at the entrance. He was scanning the room with an air of determination. His eyes landed on Margaret, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The man, clearly aged but with a posture that spoke of strength and resilience, made his way towards her. "Margaret," he called out, his voice trembling yet firm. Margaret, taken aback, turned to face him. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by a complex mix of emotions: shock, fear, and a glimmer of hope. Jamal, noticing the commotion, approached them, his protective instincts kicking in. "Is everything all right, Margaret?" Jamal asked, his voice calm but alert. The elderly man looked at Jamal, and then back at Margaret. "I need to speak with you, Margaret. It's about the past, about something you need to know." Margaret's face paled, and she nodded slowly, gesturing for Jamal to stay. "Please, Mr. Thompson, speak. This is Jamal. He's a friend." Mr. Thompson sighed deeply, gathering his thoughts. "It's about your family, Margaret. There's something you never knew, something I should have told you long ago." Jamal, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained silent, his curiosity piqued. "Years ago," Mr. Thompson began, "when you were just a child, your brother had a relationship with a woman of color. It was a time when such relationships were frowned upon, and your family kept it a secret. They had a child, a boy." Margaret's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "A child? But why didn't I know?" "Your family was ashamed," he continued. "They kept the boy's existence hidden, and eventually he was taken in by another family. That boy grew up, not knowing his true heritage. Margaret, that boy was Jamal's father." The room seemed to close in on them. Jamal's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to a profound sense of realization. "Wait," Jamal interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you saying Margaret and I are related?" Mr. Thompson nodded solemnly. "Yes, Jamal. Margaret is your great-aunt." The revelation hit them both like a tidal wave. Margaret's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of a nearby table for support. Jamal, equally stunned, took a step back, trying to process the information. "This can't be real," Margaret whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "All these years, I had no idea." Jamal, still reeling, looked at Margaret with a newfound understanding. "So, all this time, we've had this connection, and we never knew." As the weight of the revelation settled over them, Malik, who had been observing from a distance, approached cautiously. "Dad, what's going on?" Jamal turned to his son, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Malik, it turns out that Margaret is part of our family. She's your great-great-aunt." Malik's eyes widened, and he looked between his father and Margaret, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the news. "Really? But how?" Margaret, tears streaming down her face, reached out to Malik. "It's true, Malik. I didn't know until now, but it seems our lives have been intertwined in ways we never imagined." The moment was charged with a mixture of shock, sadness, and an unexpected sense of unity. Jamal, Margaret, and Malik stood together, grappling with the emotions that surged through them. Margaret took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "Jamal, I owe you an apology, not just for what happened on the bus, but for everything. My family, our family, kept secrets that shouldn't have been kept, and in doing so, they hurt us all." Jamal, his eyes filled with empathy, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We can't change the past, Margaret, but we can choose how we move forward. Maybe this revelation is a chance for us to heal and understand each other better." Malik, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped closer to Margaret. "I think we can all learn a lot from this. Maybe it's time we started acting like the family we are." The three of them stood there, a newfound bond forming amidst the chaos of their discovery. The community event continued around them, unaware of the profound transformation taking place. In that moment, the journey of reflection, empathy, and redemption that began on a crowded bus in New York City came full circle. Margaret, Jamal, and Malik, now bound by a deeper connection, faced the future with a renewed sense of hope and unity. Jamal stood on the crowded bus in New York, gripping the overhead bar tightly as the vehicle jerked through the city's bustling streets. The oppressive heat only added to the discomfort of the packed passengers. Amidst the cacophony of voices and the hum of the engine, Jamal's military-trained senses remained alert, though his expression was one of calm indifference. His mind wandered to thoughts of his son, Malik, and their strained relationship, a source of constant worry for him. Nearby, Margaret, an elderly woman with a hardened face, cast furtive glances at Jamal. Her murmurs of discontent grew louder as she muttered under her breath, casting aspersions on his character based solely on the color of his skin. Jamal, used to such baseless prejudice, tried to ignore her, focusing instead on the passing cityscape outside the window. The tension in the air was palpable, with other passengers casting uncomfortable glances in their direction. Suddenly, Margaret's bitter tirade was cut short as she clutched her chest, her face contorting in pain. She collapsed into the aisle, her body convulsing as she gasped for breath. The bus erupted in chaos, passengers scrambling to give her space, their panic evident. Jamal's training kicked in, and he swiftly knelt beside her, his hands moving with practiced precision. He checked her pulse, ensured her airway was clear, and began administering CPR, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the pandemonium around them. "Someone call 911, he shouted, his voice commanding and authoritative. A young woman nearby fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. Jamal continued his life-saving efforts, his focus unwavering. Moments later, the ambulance arrived, and paramedics took over, commending Jamal for his quick and effective response. At the hospital, Margaret slowly regained consciousness, her eyes fluttering open to the sterile white room and the rhythmic beeping of medical machines. She turned her head and saw Jamal standing at the door, speaking quietly with a doctor. Confusion and shame washed over her as the realization dawned that the man she had so harshly judged had saved her life. The doctor approached her, explaining her condition and commending Jamal's actions. "You're very lucky," the doctor said. "If it weren't for him, you might not have made it." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of gratitude and remorse. She watched as Jamal, humble and unassuming, nodded politely and left the room, his presence a stark reminder of her own prejudices. Alone with her thoughts, Margaret began to reflect deeply on her actions, the weight of her biases pressing heavily on her heart. Meanwhile, Jamal returned home to find Malik engrossed in his phone, his face a mask of teenage defiance. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Jamal tried to bridge the gap, asking about Malik's day and his struggles at school, but Malik's responses were curt and dismissive. The chasm between father and son seemed insurmountable, leaving Jamal feeling helpless and despondent. One evening, Jamal received an unexpected call from the hospital. Margaret wanted to see him again, to thank him personally. Reluctantly, Jamal agreed, sensing the potential for a difficult but necessary conversation. When he arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere was tense, but Margaret's gratitude was sincere. She expressed her heartfelt thanks, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I owe you my life." Jamal nodded, his expression softening. "Just doing what I had to do." As the days passed, Margaret's desire to make amends grew stronger. She learned about a community organization where Jamal volunteered, and she decided to join, hoping to atone for her past actions. Her journey was fraught with internal battles as she confronted her long-held prejudices and sought to change. Jamal, meanwhile, continued to support Malik, encouraging him through his academic struggles and trying to mend their fractured relationship. During a community event, the culmination of these intertwined lives took an unexpected turn. As Margaret and Jamal mingled with other volunteers, an old acquaintance of Margaret's arrived, bringing with them a revelation that would forever alter their perceptions of each other. The secret unveiled a profound and unexpected connection between Margaret and Jamal, reshaping their understanding of their past and present. This revelation set the stage for a powerful emotional reconciliation. Margaret, Jamal, and Malik found themselves united in a moment of profound understanding and forgiveness. The barriers that had once divided them crumbled, giving way to a new era of empathy and connection. Their journey, marked by initial prejudice and subsequent redemption, symbolized the transformative power of compassion and the boundless potential for human connection. The community center buzzed with activity as the neighborhood gathered for the annual charity event. Jamal stood near the entrance, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. He spotted Margaret, who was setting up a table with flyers and pamphlets for the local community service organization. It had been several months since their initial meeting, and the once tense relationship had gradually softened into mutual respect. Margaret had thrown herself into volunteer work, trying to atone for years of bitterness and prejudice. As Jamal approached her table, he noticed an elderly man with a cane making his way toward Margaret. His face seemed vaguely familiar to Jamal, but he couldn't quite place him. Margaret, on the other hand, froze as soon as she saw the man. Her hands trembled slightly, and her usually stern face softened into a mix of shock and confusion. "Margaret," the man said, his voice filled with a mix of sorrow and relief. "It's been a long time, John." Margaret's voice cracked, betraying a vulnerability that Jamal had never seen in her before. "What are you doing here?" "I heard about your heart attack and your new involvement in the community," John replied, his eyes darting nervously between Margaret and Jamal. I thought it was time to finally tell the truth." Jamal felt the air grow thick with tension. He stepped closer, ready to offer support if needed. "Is everything okay, Margaret?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. Margaret took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving John's. "Jamal, this is John, my late sister's husband." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "And there's something you both need to know." John nodded, taking a deep breath of his own. "Margaret, it's time to tell him the truth about his mother." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. His mother had always been a sensitive topic, a painful mystery he never fully unraveled. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Jamal, your mother was my sister, Sarah. She passed away when you were just a baby. John and we made a decision to keep the truth from you for reasons that seemed right at the time, but now I see how wrong we were." Jamal felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "So, you're saying, you're my aunt?" His voice was thick with disbelief and a whirlwind of emotions. "Yes," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I let my grief and anger turn into bitterness and prejudice. I pushed everyone away, including you. And I'm so sorry." Jamal took a step back, needing space to process the revelation. His mind raced through memories, trying to piece together the fragments of his past. Margaret, the woman who had been the face of hostility and resentment, was his family. The realization was both devastating and enlightening. Malik, who had been helping set up chairs nearby, noticed the commotion and walked over. "Dad, what's going on?" he asked, sensing the emotional charge in the air. Jamal turned to his son, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and hope. "Malik, this is Margaret. She's your great-aunt." Malik's eyes widened in surprise. "Wait, what? How is that even possible?" Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Malik, I made many mistakes in my life, but I'm here now to try and make things right. I want to be a part of your lives, if you'll let me." The weight of the moment settled over them all. Jamal felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger at the years of lies, but also a flicker of understanding and a desire for reconciliation. He looked at Margaret, seeing her not just as the bitter old woman on the bus, but as a person haunted by her own demons, trying desperately to make amends. "Margaret," Jamal said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I don't know if I can forgive everything overnight, but I see that you're trying. And maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to move forward together." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That's all I can ask for, Jamal. Thank you." Malik looked between his father and his newly discovered great-aunt, feeling the gravity of the moment. He stepped forward and hugged Margaret, a gesture of acceptance and hope. "Welcome to the family, Aunt Margaret." The embrace was a catalyst, breaking down the remaining walls between them. Jamal joined in, wrapping his arms around both Margaret and Malik. It was a moment of profound healing, a symbol of new beginnings and the power of empathy and understanding. As they stood there, united in their shared history and newfound connection, the noise of the community event faded into the background. For the first time in a long while, they felt a sense of peace and the promise of a brighter future. In that embrace, they found not just forgiveness, but a deeper understanding of what it meant to be family.